Reti Opening strikes again. If you are looking for an opening repertoire that offers flexibility, allowing you to choose between calm positional play and sharp dynamic attacks, sometimes maybe both at once, I would like to show you two games and introduce you to Reti Opening. Having played it throughout my chess career, I consider myself somewhat of an expert in this particular opening and its nuances and unique strategies. And I'm excited to share what makes it such a powerful weapon. I would like to show you two games from today's Chess Olympiad games that is going in Budapest, Hungary. Now, if you watched my video from yesterday, I also talked about Reti Opening, and guess what? Grandmaster Razvan Preotu from Canada played this opening again, and this time defeating youngest grandmaster in the world from Turkey, Erdogmus, who has just touched 2600 mark. He is the youngest player to cross the 2600 mark. Second game, I will show you my countryman's masterpiece, I would say. I am originally from country Georgia. Georgia faced Spain at the Olympiad in today's round, and due to this win, Georgia celebrated victory over Spain 2.5 to 1.5. Let's get to it. First, we are going to see Razvan Preotu, Grandmaster from Canada, who's been tearing the opposition on his board. I believe he is 4.5 out of 5 games. So very good result so far. Raz, keep going, my man. Game starts with knight f3. This is the Reti opening. Black plays d5. White now fianchettos bishop on the long diagonal with g3. Black responds with c6. This is a very standard way to counter the Reti opening. Bishop goes to g2 and black plays bishop to g4. Before black plays e6, they want to get the light squared bishop out. That is why bishop f5 and bishop g4 are both popular moves in this position. White plays short castle, e6, and now Razvan decides to play h3 to kick this bishop immediately to h5, and here comes c4. So the first white finished the development of the king side, and next it is time to attack the center, which he does by c4. Now, this is not a pawn sacrifice. Well, technically it is actually, but if captured on c4, now white can continue with queen c2, trying to get that pawn back immediately. If black was to play b5, this will be related to a lot of weakening of the queen side here. So maybe a4 is a possibility, maybe b3 is a possibility. Now if c takes b3, a takes b3, look at the long diagonal. Is it worth a pawn? I don't think so. Well, for black, I mean, for white, I'm happy to play these positions usually. Black played knight d7, refused to capture on c4 in the game, and white goes now d4, leaving the c4 again. But this is a standard idea of queen's gambit positions, to sacrifice c4 pawn for the activity and for the center, pretty much. Knight goes to f6, c takes d5. Now it is time to get rid of that pawn, says Razvan. Now there are definitely other moves. For example, queen b3 would be a possibility, which I believe is what he chose in the previous game. Knight to c3 is also an option, sacrificing that pawn. One could also go b3, but looks like Razvan had a clear idea what he wanted to do. And after c takes d5, e takes d5, he moves knight to e5 immediately without much hesitation. Now, there are a lot of other moves. I think queen to b3 is also a very interesting one that can lead to either queen b6 and maybe queen e3 check. I have played this myself with the idea of knight h4, and when black here returns back to g6, not to allow knight f5. By the way, there is a pin along the e file, so king cannot castle immediately here. Bishop g6. There could be ideas like either immediately f4 or maybe knight c3 first, then trying to go f4, because if black wants to finish the development, they would have to move the queen back. Now, what about f4 here? I believe f4 is not that good because of bishop e4, so that's the reason why we need knight on c3 first, controlling the e4 square. Now, white plays knight to e5. Now, what is the idea of knight e5? This is so-called Pillsbury knight. Harry Pillsbury was a strong chess player a long time ago. He coined this idea of planting the knight on e5 and then supporting it with f4, making sure that knight does not leave e5 square. After knight e5, apparently Yagiz Erdogmus goes into long think. Bishop d6 is probably what he was thinking about, but then white plays f4 anyways. Apparently, computer suggests that the correct move here is something like knight e4, which is not an easy move to make because you have not finished the development and you are going knight to e4. That is a little, well, creative to say at least. But this is not to say that position is clear or black is already fine. There are different ideas. Apparently, computer suggests take there and go knight c3, hunting for a pawn, which I guess makes some sense. Another idea, there could be queen to b3, again putting the pressure on the b7 pawn. I think this would also be quite interesting. What if we go g4 here? Then knight takes e5, and apparently bishop will just retreat back to g6. So already on move 10, we have a relatively unknown position that has not been playing that many times at the high level between Grandmasters. So black plays a natural looking move, bishop to e7, which, as you can see, computer already evaluates as an inaccuracy. Apparently now going f4 immediately would try to put this bishop immediately in trouble. Razvan develops the knight first on c3, and after bishop retreats back to g6, then he goes f4. Again, look at white's time. They have not spent any time whatsoever so far, which shows that he is prepared. He's still in his comfort zone. Now, this bishop is about to get in trouble. White wants to play f5 and then g4 to trap the bishop. If black was to play h6, that would weaken black's king side by a lot. For example, queen d3, right now immediately putting the pressure on the g6 pawn. So for that reason, Yagiz decides to play bishop e4. Let's make sure that bishop doesn't get in trouble. Now, however, white has a comfortable way to force things here after trading knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and rightfully so, he takes on e4 as well with the bishop. D takes e4 and queen b3 double attack on f7 and b7 pawns. Now black is pretty much forced to take on e5. Apparently, actually, computer says going short castle here and sacrificing this pawn on b7 would also be okay, but white still maintains the advantage here. I wouldn't say this is okay, especially if you're not familiar with the computer's evaluation. Weakening your pawn structure deadly like that is not an easy job. D takes e5, apparently bishop c5 here, king g2, something like queen d4. Black can try to get the counterplay based on the fact that white has not developed this bishop on c1. Well, natural looking knight e5 is what happens in the game. Now d takes e5 since that pawn was hanging on d4 with the check. And let's evaluate the position now. What is happening here? Well, white has 5 pawns on the queen side here. Black has 4 pawns. But more importantly, this pawn on e5 f4 is going to give white a lot of space. Now, space advantage means that while with white will have more flexibility for his pieces. Also, a very important detail in the position is that e5 pawn is protected and e4 is not. So e4 is a potential target and already a weakness. Computer evaluates that position as +1 point already, even more than 1 point for white. That means a considerable advantage. Bishop goes to c5 check. Now white blocks it with bishop to e3. Bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, queen to b6. Otherwise, this pawn would be very difficult to defend. For example, if queen d5, then simply rook d1, and the next move, this rook is going to come to d4 if you were to defend it with something like queen c4. So black tries to trade queens here with queen b6. King goes to f2. Now, a very nice move, again made without any hesitation, as we can see on the clock. Now, if black was to trade on e3, king takes e3, and again e4 pawn is lost. I am honestly amazed by the simplicity of Razvan's play in this game, and how easily he managed to get a very considerable advantage against a very strong opponent. Black plays king to e7. Now pawn goes to a4, another very strong move, and surprise, surprise, first suggestion of the computer. Looks like my man Raz has done some homework here. With pawn on a4, what is the point? Basically, I think white wants to kick this queen away from b6, and if they were to take on b2, then queen c5 check, or rook to b1 first, taking on b7 with the check, queen c5, this is a game over. That king is going to get in trouble. That was, by the way, the case if black had captured on b2 on the previous move. For example, after king f2 here, if queen takes b2, still rook to b1, then winning the b7 pawn and ruining black's pawn structure. So after a4 here, black decides to play rook to d8, pawn to a5, pretty much forcing the queen trade on e3. King takes e3, and black plays rook to d5, trying to at least take control of the d file while white captures the pawn on e4. Well, white says, not yet. I want to play a6 to weaken your pawn structure, and once you play rook to b5, I'll take on b7, rook takes b7, and then I'm bringing rook on c1 to target your weakness. Black defends that pawn with rook b6, and white also defends his pawn on b2 with rook a2. Pawn to a5, it is now time to capture pawn on e4 and claim an extra pawn. Also, an important detail, white now has pawn majority on the king side that cannot easily be stopped. That is 5 pawns versus opponent's 3. Okay, that is a big difference on one side of the board. And on the other side of the board, black has 2 weak pawns against white's 1. Most likely, these pawns are not going to be able to pose the threat. Okay, and as we'll see, they'll get captured quite easily here. King back to f3 here, since there was a check, then pawn to e3, a4, and the rest of the conversion was done almost flawlessly by Razvan. He is still hour and 30 minutes on the clock, which I think is quite amazing. Now rook to a1, g5, and b3. Let's clear what are we doing. Let's show our cards. White wants to play b3, get rid of the pawns on the queen side, and leave the game on the king side, basically. 5 pawns versus 3. Rook takes b3, since this is pinned. Rook takes a4, rook takes a4, rook takes a4, g takes a4, g takes f4. Now 3 pawns here versus black's 1 pawn. Rook to c3, try to support this pawn on the c file. Black goes king to e4, rook to c2, and now game is pretty much decided, because after rook a7 check, king cannot come up because of f5 checkmate, actually pawn checkmate, and after king f8, king goes to f5 with the idea of going king f6 next. Black now tries to stop it with a rook to g2. So if king f6, there is rook g6 check. But now e6 is winning because after captures, white will have two connected passed pawns. If rook to e2 here, there will be either simply defending the rook behind from a3 or maybe going king f6 first. Because if you are to take here, there will be rook a8, rook there, captures, king g7, and now white will promote with the check right after f7 check. So after king takes e6, rook g6 was played, king simply returns back, rook g3, now e4. Obviously, white does not want to part ways with the connected passed pawns here. e4, rook takes h3, both sides have two pawns, but the difference is huge. Connected passed pawns in the endgame is going to be unstoppable, especially in the rook endgame here. And that is exactly what happens. f5, now king lands on f6 here. Again, capturing on e4 would result to a lost pawn endgame here. Now pawn is even closer than in the previous line. King to g5, rook moved away, then rook takes pawn, and eventually once white pawns get going, game is going to be over. e6, and black resigned. What a win by Razvan, a very impressive play throughout the entire game. Not to say anything about last two games that I talked in the previous video. If you have not checked it out, I would recommend doing so. Now let's see another game that I wanted to show you. This game is also very interesting in my opinion. Number one board from Georgia, my country, is facing Alexei Shirov, legend of chess, I would say, and legend of attacking chess. There are countless books written on his name and on his games. One of the most notable ones, Fire on the Board, which I have enjoyed thoroughly. He was actually one of two students of Mikheil, the world champion and by many considered greatest attacking player of all time. Now, Alexei is originally from Latvia, where Mikheil was also from. I believe since his young years he's been representing Spain, like in this tournament. So let's see. Game starts with knight f3, black responds with d5, and little different to previous games here. Mikheil decides to respond d5 with c4, early c4 here, putting the pressure on the d5 pawn. Black plays e3, e6, and then white plays g3 to fianchetto the bishop on the long diagonal. Standard move for the Reti opening. Black plays knight to f6, bishop goes to g2, bishop to e7. Now this is basically standard queen's gambit declined response from the black side when they simply try to play d5, e6, knight f6, bishop e7, short castle. One of the most popular tries against, I would say, d4, against c4, and against the Reti openings. For black, it kind of makes sense to use this one system for all those white openings. Now, white decides to play b3, move that I myself have played a lot. Now, this is a sideline if white does not want to go for the mainline Catalan with d4, which leads to a lot of theoretical battles and theoretical discussions. So if white usually does not want to step into that theoretical battle, then b3 is a perfect alternative to now double fianchetto the bishop on the other long diagonal. Now black decided here, and not too surprisingly, to imbalance the position with d4. Alexei Shirov is known, as I mentioned here at the start, known for his imbalanced approach, I would say, and dynamic approach, specifically going for the uncompromising play. Now white plays e3, black has to maintain the center with c5, and here we have a very interesting modern try, knight to e5. I myself have employed this move, which is relatively new. I believe became popular, or at least that's where I saw it, when Dingliren, current reigning world champion, defeated Anishkiri in an example game. That is where I saw it first. I'm not actually exactly sure what is the origin story of it, but I have seen recently this move becoming quite popular. Now, what is the idea of knight e5 really? Now, if black was to play queen to c7, white wants to move this knight either back to d3, also rook to e1 first, maybe to secure the knight on e5. Immediately going knight to d3 here is also an option. Also a very interesting option is f4. I believe this is how the game between Dingliren and Anishkiri continued. Knight goes to d3, and after e5, not sure there was first knight a3 or immediate g4 here, leading to a very interesting play. Now, what is knight doing on d3? Well, it is putting the pressure on the black's center here, allows white to play f4 and create this very interesting dynamic where black does not have a way to comfortably develop pieces. For example, if e4 here, then knight goes to f2. Now this e4 pawn may become a target and very difficult to defend, in fact. So a very complicated position. I am also not 100% sure what is exactly going on here. Alexei decides to respond to it with an interesting attempt after about 8 minutes of think. Knight to e8. I'm assuming the threat here is to hope go f6, e5, and keep that knight away like that and secure the center. But now white plays f4 after 10 minutes of think here. I'm curious, actually, yes, that was only 2 minutes spent on knight e5 move. So I'm not sure if Mikheil was prepared for this or not, but what a game this transforms into. f4, now black plays knight d7 to get rid of this knight. White plays bishop to b2, saying that be my guest, now you can take on e5, f takes e5, but the point will be that your d4 pawn is going to be somewhat problematic to defend. Now, if you were to take on e3, then d takes e3. Another very interesting attempt, by the way, is queen e2, sacrificing this pawn entirely. And look at white's position now. Both bishops on the long diagonals, powerful e5 pawn, making that e8 knight look miserable. A lot of space, knight headed towards e4, where it can potentially jump to f6. Rook is going to come to d file. Bishop on c8 is passive. Bishop on e7 is passive. And look at all black pieces. None of them have targets. All right, so I think it is definitely worth a pawn here for white. So black doesn't capture on e3, instead tries to get some breathing air for his pieces here with f5, e takes d4, c takes d4, d3, fixing the pawns in the center, and now d4 pawn will become a long-term weakness. Rook goes to f7. As we can see, black is struggling to find any useful moves pretty much. He could have probably brought the knight, but then what? Bishop can get out because the b7 pawn is hanging. So they have to get creative. They play rook to f7. Now knight goes to a3. Where is that knight headed? To c2 to attack the d4 pawn. Bishop retreats back to f8. Knight comes to c8. And rook to d7 to defend that pawn on d4. Now white plays b4. This knight on c2, in general, knight a3, knight c2 maneuver is very common in Benoni type of structures and positions. Idea is to put the pressure on the opponent's center and also prepare this b4 queenside expansion. Same when black plays knight a6, knight c7 in Benoni trying to push b5. Black responds this with a5, white plays a3, I believe because of the c5 square, white will want to surround now this d4 pawn, and black would be able to, if pawn was on b5, then black would be able to park his bishop on c5 very comfortably, and at least one piece has a good space. But that's not the case here. Black plays g5, maybe to stop rook f4, because yeah, actually white wanted to play rook f4 to take that pawn immediately. So black plays g5 to stop it, but now that is gonna open another bag of worms, meaning the king side is weakened. So queen goes to d2, bishop g7. Now it is right, queen cannot come to rook cannot come to f4, but queen can come to f2 to attack the pawn on d4. Bishop takes e5, temporary pawn sacrifice. Now white returns to the e file, attacking the bishop and the pawn on e6. Queen takes e6, rook blocks it. Now queen comes to d5, and black's situation is very difficult here. This rook is pinned, no active pieces whatsoever, and d4 pawn is in trouble, and that is what happens. Black tries to get at least one piece in the game here, specifically this bishop, light square bishop, but that drops the b7 pawn. Then queen returns back to d5, and after a desperate bishop a4 attempt, white simply protects that knight on c2, threatening now to take on d8 and then move bishop to d5, winning an exchange here. White is already up a pawn. d4 pawn is also going to be gone, so that is going to be at least 2 pawns and connected passed pawns that is going to be impossible to stop. So Alexei Shirov decided to resign. Now we gotta understand, resignation might be a little immature, you may think, but we are talking about the legend of chess who has been 2750 for about 2 decades. So this was very clear to him that things has gone south for him, so he thought this was enough. All right, those were 2 games that I wanted to show. With these games, I start to develop a little bit of a collection on Reti openings. I may make a separate playlist for Reti, since that is one of my favorite openings, and hopefully we get to see some more exciting Reti opening / first knight f3 games in this Olympiad. Cheers, I'll see you in the next one.